Dominique Wilkins is one of the most brilliant icons the NBA has ever produced. For more than a decade at his peak, he wasn't just the star of the Atlanta Hawks, he was the embodiment of ferocious beauty in American basketball. The nickname "human highlight film" wasn't media hype, it was an acknowledgement of the dunks that set arenas on fire and changed the way people perceived the limits of the human body. Wilkins made 9 NBA All-Star appearances, earned multiple All-NBA selections, and once averaged over 30 points per game in a season, a feat reserved for the greatest scorers in history. He won the slam dunk contest twice, in legendary cultural showdowns that placed him shoulder to shoulder with, or even directly challenging, Michael Jordan in the memory of an entire generation. Most importantly, he spent his entire prime career with Atlanta, a city without a championship dynasty, but with one man willing to carry all the hope on his shoulders. In a league increasingly dominated by super teams and big markets, Wilkins shone like an independent flame, proving that greatness can exist even without a championship ring as final proof. But behind the numbers and the slow-motion footage lies another story, one heavier and far less talked about. Every soaring leap that brought roars from the crowd also quietly eroded his body in ways no one could see. Wilkins traded his health, the integrity of his body, and even his sense of invincibility to stay at the top for so long. When his career ended, what awaited him wasn't peaceful retirement, but years of facing his body's betrayal, culminating in kidney failure that forced him into a life-or-death kidney transplant. That was the moment the legend had to learn to accept vulnerability, to live dependent on medication and medical care, a reality completely opposite to the flying image that made him famous. And yet Wilkins didn't collapse. He chose to keep living quietly, using his own experience to speak out for organ donation, for the health of athletes after retirement, and for the value of understated resilience. The pain didn't turn him bitter, it forged a calm, steady will to accept the price he paid without complaint, and to keep existing with the dignity of someone who gave everything without demanding salvation in return. If you want to keep exploring the untold hidden corners behind Dominique Wilkins' career and life, please subscribe to the channel to join us for the next part of the story. Thank you for listening, and see you in the next chapter where greatness begins to be paid for with invisible losses. After the lights of the legend fade, the story has to turn back to where all the hurt began, to the time when Dominique Wilkins didn't yet know the sound of roaring crowds, didn't know fame, only knew the feeling of having to stand alone in a world that didn't allow weakness. He was born into a military family where discipline was the main language, and affection was rare and doled out so sparingly, it was almost invisible. Wilkins' childhood wasn't tied to one fixed home, without familiar evenings or friends who grew up alongside him through the years. Instead, it was a constant chain of moves, hurried goodbyes, new rooms that never had time to feel warm before he had to leave again. In that world, stability didn't exist, and the feeling of safety was never considered a right. His father, a U.S. Air Force officer, believed children had to be strong before they could be fragile, had to endure before they could ask for anything, and had to stand tall before they were allowed to fall. Praise was rare, hugs were almost non-existent, and comforting words were never seen as necessary. Dominique grew up in an environment where emotions weren't encouraged, where sadness had to be swallowed, and where pain was considered a natural part of growing up. No one taught him how to speak up when he was tired. No one asked how he felt after yet another school change or being torn away from everything familiar, and no one showed him that some pain didn't have to be carried alone. Instead, that boy learned a cold but enduring lesson to survive. You endure to be recognized, you don't complain to be seen, you have to be stronger than your own pain. In that long silence, Dominique Wilkins formed a quiet but dangerous belief that his worth didn't come from being loved, but from how much he could endure. The better he endured, the more he felt he deserved to exist. The better he suppressed pain, the more he believed he was doing what was expected. That childhood didn't create a weak child, but it also didn't create a child who knew how to protect himself. It created a person who learned to ignore his body's signals, who learned to see exhaustion as something to overcome, and who learned to view stopping as a sign of failure. There were no loud memories of tragedy, no single explosive moment to name the hurt, just the prolonged absence of gentleness. and that absence was the deepest cut of all. Dominique didn't carry visible scars, but he carried a dangerous habit, always moving forward, no matter the cost. While other kids learned to ask for help, he learned to endure alone. While other kids were allowed to be tired, he learned to see tiredness as something shameful. And right in those seemingly quiet years, the seeds of all the later tragedy were planted silently and perfectly. A boy not taught to listen to his own pain grows into a man who doesn't know when to stop. A child taught that love must be earned through endurance grows up believing the more he sacrifices, the more he's worth. Dominique Wilkins stepped out of childhood without tears, without resentment, but with a cold, relentless will that was almost cruel to himself. And later, when he threw himself into basketball, leaping, falling, then rising again to the cheers of tens of thousands, no one realized he wasn't just playing a sport, he was continuing to live by the first lesson etched into his blood: enduring is duty, stopping is not allowed. That's why, right from the earliest days of his life, long before he became the human highlight film, Dominique Wilkins was being prepared for a fate where he could endure immense pain, but would never learn how to save himself from it. From that childhood foundation where endurance was the measure of worth, Dominique Wilkins stepped into basketball not as a kid seeking joy, but as a person searching for a reason to exist. For him, the ball wasn't just a tool for competition, it was the only door out of the invisibility that had followed him since early childhood. On the court, for the first time, Dominique felt something his strict military family and endless moves had never given him: other people's eyes stopping on him. But that attention didn't come from safe plays, from being just good enough or moderate. It came from ferocious leaps, from the moment his body left the ground as if ready to hurl himself into empty space just to be seen, remembered, recognized. For Wilkins, the dunk wasn't a skill, and it certainly wasn't a performance, it was a declaration of existence. Every time he soared, he was telling the world, "I'm here, I deserve to be here, I'm not the child overlooked in the strange rooms of my childhood." And gradually, Wilkins himself began to believe that only when he jumped the highest, slammed the hardest, made the crowd hold its breath and then explode, did his existence truly matter. Basketball became the only language he knew to connect with the world, and his body became the only tool to speak it. No one taught Wilkins he could be loved just for being himself. No one told him presence didn't have to be paid for with pain. So he set his own harsh rule: the more it hurts, the better. The more risk, the more it's worth. Every leap didn't just drain energy, it slowly eroded the belief that he could exist without destroying himself. While others learned to play smarter, to preserve their bodies for a longer career, Wilkins learned to break his own limits at any cost, because breaking limits was the only way he knew to be seen. The feeling of hanging in mid-air, in that split second before landing, was both his freest moment and his most dangerous. But right in that fragile boundary, he felt most alive. The court became the only place he allowed himself to be fully present, even if the price was heavier and heavier collisions, landings increasingly brutal on his knees, back, and kidneys. The crowd saw the beauty of the dunk, but not the quiet belief forming inside Wilkins that if one day he could no longer fly, he would no longer have a reason to be noticed. Basketball, therefore, didn't just save him from invisibility, it quietly set him on a long path of self-destruction. No one stood on the sidelines to remind him he didn't need to sacrifice his body to deserve the public's love. No one said being seen didn't mean having to hurt yourself. And Wilkins, faithful to the lesson from childhood, kept enduring in silence. He didn't complain, didn't cry for help, didn't slow down. Every time his body sent signals of fatigue, he treated it as a challenge to overcome, not a warning to listen to. Over the years, the dunks grew more ferocious, the landings more punishing, and the whole dangerous spiral was cheered by the world with applause. The tragedy lies here: that very applause confirmed Wilkins' deepest fear, that only when he hurt himself would people pay attention to him. And while the crowd called it courage, warrior spirit, somewhere inside, a man was gradually equating his self-worth with the level of damage he could withstand. Dominique Wilkins didn't enter basketball intending to destroy himself from the start, but day by day, Game by game, leap by leap, he learned a wrong but persistent lesson: to be seen, you must accept pain. To be loved, you must trade your body. No one taught him that love doesn't have to be bought with blood and sweat, until it's all gone. And that very gap in emotional education turned his extraordinary talent into a journey where every moment of glory carried the seeds of collapse. When Dominique Wilkins set foot in Atlanta, it wasn't just a career turning point, it was the beginning of a decades-long lopsided relationship between one man and one collective. The Atlanta Hawks weren't a powerhouse ready to contend for the throne, not a team wrapped in historical glory, or shielded by a dynasty. It was a city desperate to be believed in, a franchise lacking a winning identity, and they found everything they needed in Wilkins. From very early on, he wasn't just the star player, he became the soul, the emotional anchor, the reason the stands stayed packed and the city still had the right to dream. But while Atlanta gave Wilkins love and expectation, they never gave him the most important thing a legend needs: protection. Wilkins carried that team on his own body, through extended minutes, through the crushing scoring responsibility season after season, and through a near-blind loyalty to the jersey he chose. The Hawks needed Wilkins to survive in the brutal competition of the NBA, but they rarely built a roster strong enough to share that burden. While other big teams protected their stars with depth, load management strategies, and long-term investment in health, Atlanta let Wilkins keep launching, keep flying, keep crashing down, as if his body were an infinite resource. Wilkins' loyalty was never questioned. He didn't complain, didn't demand, didn't publicly apply pressure. He believed his duty was to fight, to bring hope, to give the Hawks a reason to exist on the NBA map. But that very silence made the relationship lopsided. The city and the team took everything he could give, without ever truly asking what he was losing. Each passing season, Wilkins had to shoulder more responsibility, more minutes, more brutal collisions that no single person should bear alone. When he got injured, it was bad news for the team, but rarely a wake-up call to change how they used him. When he returned to the court, the crowd roared, and the system sighed in relief, as if the machine had been temporarily patched to keep running. In that relationship, Wilkins wasn't allowed to weaken, because his weakness meant the collapse of the entire collective. The Atlanta Hawks needed Wilkins at his best, but never created the conditions for him to sustain that best long-term. Tense seasons followed one after another, brutal matchups against stronger powers, and painful playoff failures didn't just wear down his spirit, they wore down his body bit by bit. While other legends were surrounded by super teams, given calculated rest, protected like strategic assets, Wilkins became a warrior pushed to the front line over and over again. He fought for Atlanta with everything he had, but Atlanta never fought hard enough to protect him from that very sacrifice. This is the tragedy of one-sided loyalty. One man gave his complete devotion, while the collective only took the immediate results. The city loved Wilkins, but the system didn't love his body. The fans cheered the dunks, but no voice was loud enough to demand he stop, slow down, take care. And Wilkins, raised from childhood in the belief that worth lies in endurance, kept moving forward in silence. He didn't leave Atlanta when he had the chance, didn't seek easier paths, didn't choose to stand behind stronger rosters to protect himself. He stayed, because staying was the most loyal thing he knew. But loyalty, in this case, didn't bring safety. It only prolonged the exhaustion. Looking back, the relationship between Wilkins and the Atlanta Hawks is like a sad love song of American sports, full of emotion, full of sacrifice, but lacking balance. A city placed its faith in one man, and one man carried the whole city until there was nothing left to carry. Wilkins became the greatest icon of the Hawks, but also the clearest proof of the price a legend pays when there's no strong enough collective to shield him. Throughout those years, there was no loud betrayal, no public breakdown, just quiet erosion, where each season added a new layer of damage on top of old wounds that never fully healed. And right in that silence, the tragedy of Dominique Wilkins' one-sided loyalty to the Atlanta Hawks was completed. A man who gave everything he had, while the system he served was never strong enough to give him back the protection he deserved. If Atlanta was where Dominique Wilkins gave his full loyalty, Then the slam dunk contest was where he gave his entire body to the public's imagination. It was there that the nickname human highlight film stopped being a fun moniker and became an iconic definition, forever tied to the image of a man willing to tear through the limits of his body to create beauty that made all of America hold its breath. Dominique Wilkins entered those dunk contests not just to win, but to prove how high a human could fly when unafraid of falling. Every leap he took was a direct challenge to gravity, to logic, and to his own safety. The crowd screamed, television broadcast every moment in slow motion, and mainstream American culture found the perfect image for the desire to rise above fate, a black man soaring, hanging in midair, then slamming the ball down with all the anger and pride accumulated from years of being overlooked. The slam dunk contest wasn't just a sporting event, it became a cultural ritual, where Wilkins was celebrated as the embodiment of pure power and ferocious beauty. But right in those moments, a cruel truth was perfectly hidden. To create that beauty, Wilkins had to keep hurting himself. His body, step by step, leap by leap, was turned into an entertainment product consumed without end. People talked about height, about vertical leap, about creativity, but no one asked what price he paid to keep that magic alive. No one stopped to think that every landing on the hardwood was a collision his joints had to absorb, a tiny crack forming somewhere in his body, and that those cracks never fully disappeared. Wilkins competed in an era when sports science wasn't advanced enough to protect flying legs like his, and in a culture that always encouraged higher, stronger, more ferocious, no matter the long-term cost. When he faced off against Michael Jordan in those legendary dunk battles, the whole world only saw two gods in the air, without realizing that every leap was steadily shortening the lifespan of a body that had already endured too much. Wilkins understood that the audience didn't come to see moderation, they came to see limits broken, and because he'd been taught since childhood that worth lies in endurance, he didn't hesitate to offer his own body to that expectation. The dunks became the common language between him and the public, but it was a cruel language, because it could only be sustained through pain. Every landing, his knees absorbed the impact like an overcompressed spring. Every twist in the air put terrifying pressure on his back and kidneys. But Wilkins didn't stop, because stopping meant losing the only thing that made him seen, loved, celebrated. In that peak moment, he became an icon, but he was also locked into the image the public demanded. Human highlight film sounds like an honor, but it's also a trap. Once you become highlight footage, you're forced to keep producing new clips, no matter the cost. No one questioned the sustainability of Wilkins' body, because American sports back then weren't ready to face the dark side of entertainment. Beauty was prioritized over safety, the moment over the aftermath, and Wilkins, loyal to the role the world assigned him, kept flying. He didn't cry out in pain, didn't complain, didn't ask for rest. He let the roars drown out every warning signal from his body. When the lights were on, he became an artist in the air. When the lights went off, he was left with just a tired body carrying wounds no one wanted to see. The tragedy is this: the very moments considered the most beautiful in Wilkins' career were the moments he moved closer to physical collapse. Every landing wasn't just the end of a play, it was the beginning of a new crack, piling onto old cracks that never healed. And while NBA history preserves those dunks as works of art, Wilkins' body preserved them as debts that could never be erased. His peak was built on systematic self-destruction, cheered by millions of eyes, and sustained by a mistaken but deeply rooted belief that the greatest beauty can only come from the greatest pain. Looking back, the slam dunk contest wasn't just the stage where Wilkins became immortal in fans' memories, it was also the place where he quietly lost pieces of himself, trading them for seconds the world would remember forever, while he had to carry the consequences for the rest of his life. When the last dunks gradually became memories, and the roaring cheers began to fade, a cold truth quietly flooded into Dominique Wilkins' life. In the world of American sports, greatness always comes with an unspoken condition, and that condition is called the championship ring. Wilkins scored more points than most of his contemporaries, captivated an entire generation with the ferocious beauty of his aerial assaults, carried an entire city on his shoulders for years. But when the story gets retold in the voice of history, people start adding a bitter clause: great but never enough. No ring, no moment standing on the ultimate peak, and from there his entire career gets pulled back, not because of a lack of effort, but because of the absence of a symbol that the collective and circumstances never gave him. The media, which once hailed Wilkins as the embodiment of power and beauty, gradually changed its tone. Articles no longer began with admiration, but with comparison. Questions no longer revolved around his talent, but around what he never accomplished. History, through simplified storytelling, began to say he lacked the most important thing, and that thing, ironically, was something an individual could never create alone. Wilkins was framed in a painful role, the one who almost reached the top, the one who was close enough, the one worth remembering, but not complete. In that narrative, all his sacrifices got compressed into a small minus sign at the end of the line, as if everything he gave only had value if stamped with collective victory. No one asked how many minutes he had to play, how many exhausting seasons he endured, how many brutal landings he took just to keep a team alive in fierce competition. No one asked how much he had to suffer to turn everyday games into unforgettable memories for the fans. Instead, people asked why no ring, and in that question, Wilkins' honor was wounded in a quiet but profound way. For a man raised in the belief that worth lies in endurance, being told he wasn't enough felt like a complete denial of everything he had traded away. He didn't argue back, didn't debate, didn't launch a campaign to defend his image. Wilkins accepted that label with the familiar silence, just as he had accepted physical pain throughout his career. But that silence didn't mean no hurt. It only meant the pain was kept inside, where no cameras could shine. In a culture that worships ultimate victory, Wilkins became the textbook example of the cruelty of collective memory. People can love you in the moment, but history will only keep you if you fit its winning template. And that template has no room for legends who carried weak rosters, no room for individuals loyal to the point of exhaustion, no room for those who gave everything but weren't placed in the right circumstances to win the final ring. The most painful part wasn't that Wilkins had no ring, it was the way that fact was used to diminish his entire career, as if the years soaring through the air, the nights playing selflessly, the moments that made arenas explode, were just an incomplete prelude to a proper story. In that telling, Wilkins wasn't allowed to be enough in his own way. He had to lack something, so someone else's story could feel more complete. And so, while his body carried unhealable cracks from those landings long ago, his honor also carried an invisible scratch, created by the way history chooses to remember and to forget. Wilkins gave everything an individual could give in elite sports, but when the curtain fell, the reward he received wasn't full recognition, it was a lingering question mark about what he lacked. That's where the tragedy of his honor was completed, not being criticized for laziness or lack of talent, but being judged as deficient despite having given until there was nothing left to give. After being framed as almost enough and so close, Dominique Wilkins entered the most painful phase without a single on-court collision, the phase of being quietly left behind by the era. The NBA, like every other massive American entertainment machine, doesn't stop to look back at what it has consumed. The league changed eras, changed pace, changed imagery. New faces appeared, younger, faster, more suited to the new storytelling of television and advertising. Basketball began speaking a different language, and Wilkins, once the icon of visual explosion, suddenly wasn't timely anymore, not because he suddenly became worse, but because the league decided to turn the page without bringing along the legends from the previous one. There was no grand tribute, no extended farewell tour, no continuous highlight reels broadcast to etch his image deeper into collective memory. Wilkins drifted out of the spotlight quietly, as if his presence had once been taken for granted, and his absence was too. In a sports culture that worships the present moment, memory that isn't maintained fades quickly. The NBA didn't deliberately turn its back on Wilkins with any specific action, and that's what made it the cruelest part. No one chased him away. No one declared him outdated. They simply stopped needing him at the center of the story. TV shows moved on to other faces. Discussions about legends shifted to new dynasties. And Wilkins, who once had the entire league revolving around him, became a name mentioned less and less, then rarely, then only in historical compilations. There was no proper goodbye to let him know he had closed an important chapter. No official moment to put a period at the end and say farewell. His career didn't end with a final round of applause, it ended with prolonged silence. For a man who had lived his entire life being seen, no longer being looked at was a deep mental blow. Wilkins didn't resist, didn't voice complaints, didn't demand attention. He accepted it the same way he had accepted every previous injury, with silence and endurance. But silence doesn't make pain disappear, it only makes the pain have no place to be named. In those years, Wilkins watched the NBA honor others, build monuments to new icons, tell new stories more appealing to young audiences. He wasn't jealous, but he couldn't help feeling the emptiness, because this very league had taken so much from his body, from his health, from his youth, and now it moved on without turning back to see if he was still standing. A legend not eliminated by scandal, not overthrown by failure, but phased out by the natural flow of time. That's the cruelest way to leave the stage, not being pushed out, but being forgotten. When the lights no longer shone on him, Wilkins stood at the edge of his own story. He carried the title of legend, but no longer had space to live in it. And in that void, he began to understand that the greatest tragedy of his life wasn't the lack of a championship ring. It was that everything he had sacrificed for this league wasn't enough to guarantee him a respected ending. The NBA kept moving forward, as it always does, while Dominique Wilkins drifted out of the center of the light with no one holding him back, no one asking what price he had paid to bring the league to where it is today. It was in that moment, when there were no more cheers to drown it out, that the raw truth emerged in the world of professional sports. Even the greatest legends can be turned away from by the era, not with hostility, but with cold, prolonged forgetting. When the NBA moved on and the lights no longer stopped on the name Dominique Wilkins, his post-retirement life didn't open like a new chapter, it felt like a long cold void with no directions. For the first time in his life, Wilkins woke up without a game schedule to cling to, without practice hours, without flights, without arenas waiting. For many, that might be liberation. For Wilkins, it was the disappearance of the entire structure that had kept him upright for decades. He had once lived to the rhythm of the season, measured time by remaining games, defined the value of a day by how much his body had endured. When all of that vanished, nothing replaced it right away. No one had prepared him for how to exist in a day without physical pain to prove he was still useful. No more roars to drown out thoughts, no more adrenaline to keep the mind in fighting mode. Silence arrived like a new sound, heavy and uncomfortable, forcing Wilkins to face himself in a way he never had before. His body, once pushed to the limit, and praised for its endurance, began betraying him slowly but mercilessly. The pains were no longer blurred by the feeling of victory, or the cheers. They showed up clearer every morning, every time he stood up, every time he walked, like reminders that the price of those years flying through the air didn't vanish when the career ended. But physical pain, though familiar, still wasn't the biggest challenge. What truly broke Wilkins was the mental void. He had spent his entire life learning how to exist in pain, turning exhaustion into fuel, using endurance as the measure of worth. When pain was no longer tied to a specific goal, when endurance was no longer rewarded with recognition, he began to lose his way. Long days passed without a clear role, without an identity to hold on to, forcing him to confront the question he had always avoided. If he's no longer a player, if he's no longer the human highlight film, then who is Dominique Wilkins? There was no grand farewell ceremony to mark the transition, no ritual to help him put a period at the end and start something else. His career ended in silence, and his aftermath began in that same silence. Wilkins didn't turn to the media to talk about the emptiness, didn't try to create a new image to fill the void. He stayed with himself, and that made the crisis deeper, because when pain was no longer purposeful, he had to face a different kind of pain, the pain of not knowing what he existed for. Long nights became heavy, not because the body couldn't sleep, but because the mind couldn't find an anchor. He had once been a man who only knew how to exist through pain, and now, when pain was no longer framed by competition, it became meaningless and more cruel than ever. No opponents to overcome, no games to wait for, no opening tip to signal he was still needed. Each passing day felt like a game with no audience, where Wilkins was both the player, the witness, and the loser in the battle against emptiness. He wasn't used to caring for himself in a gentle way, wasn't used to listening to the small signals from his body, because his whole life he'd been taught those signals had to be ignored. So when his body started demanding attention, he didn't know how to respond, except by continuing to endure. His spirit collapsed not with a violent fall, but with the constant erosion of identical days, where there was no peak to aim for, and no meaningful pain to cling to. In that prolonged stillness, Wilkins gradually realized a painful truth. His entire life had been built around overcoming pain, but no one had ever taught him how to live when there was no clear battle ahead. Retirement didn't just take away his job, it took away the language he used to understand himself, and when that language disappeared, Wilkins had to face an entirely new form of existence, where silence was no longer a pause between games, but the permanent state. It was in the longest silence of his life that Dominique Wilkins began to reach the bottom of his existential crisis. A man once seen by the whole world now had to learn how to look at himself without any applause as background. After the prolonged silence of retirement, when his spirit still hadn't found a new anchor, Dominique Wilkins was forced to confront another truth, more cruel, more specific and impossible to avoid. His body had never truly recovered. The injuries once pushed back by adrenaline, by packed game schedules, and by the roar of the crowds now returned like debts coming due. His knees ached every morning, his back stiffened after restless nights, the deep fatigue in his joints no longer faded after familiar warm-up movements. The body once seen as the perfect instrument for soaring flights, now moved slowly, heavily, like a machine that had been overworked for far too long, without ever receiving a proper overhaul. Wilkins realized that throughout his career, he had never allowed himself enough rest to fully heal. Every injury had been handled with the same philosophy: endure a little more, get through one more game, and it'll be fine. But when there were no more games ahead, it'll be fine became an empty promise. His body carried every ignored moment, every warning signal that had been suppressed beneath layers of iron will. Exhaustion was no longer a temporary state after a season, it became the baseline feeling, low-burning and persistent. Days when he felt tired for no clear reason, moments when energy drained after ordinary activities, started appearing more and more often. But Wilkins didn't panic. He was used to fatigue. He had lived his entire life in fatigue. Taught from childhood that worth lies in endurance, he continued to see these signs as an inevitable part of aging and a brutal playing past. He didn't seek help right away, didn't stop to ask the hard questions. Just as he had done for decades before, he kept pushing forward, believing that if he was tough enough, his body would adjust on its own. But this time, his body no longer followed the old rules. The signs of kidney failure began to emerge quietly and subtly. There was no dramatic collapse, no instant breakdown, just prolonged fatigue, unexplained weakness, small but persistent changes in the daily feeling of being alive. Wilkins ignored them, not because he dismissed health, but because he had never been taught how to seriously listen to his own body. In the world where he grew up and played, listening to the body often meant weakness, and weakness was unacceptable. So he kept enduring, kept living, as if what was happening was just a harmless echo of a great career. But physical tragedy doesn't operate on the logic of will. It accumulates, bit by bit, in silence. Old injuries don't disappear, they stack up. Exhaustion doesn't fade, it digs deeper. And the disease forming inside his body didn't care about fame or past glory. At a certain point, what Wilkins had once ignored could no longer be ignored. His body, pushed to the limit for so many years, began sending signals that couldn't be brushed off. But even when facing more serious warnings, Wilkins' first reflex was still to endure. He didn't complain, didn't seek pity. He told himself he had survived far more brutal collisions on the court, that this was just another challenge to overcome. What he didn't realize was that this time, there was no opening tip, no final buzzer, no fans rising to cheer as he struggled back to his feet. This was a long, quiet battle, where every passing day chipped away a little more strength. The tragedy lies here, the very qualities that made Dominique Wilkins a legend: endurance, silence, the willingness to sacrifice his body, now became the factors making his condition worse. He had learned to ignore pain too well, to the point where he didn't recognize when pain had crossed the safety line. He had grown so used to treating his body as a tool serving a goal, that he forgot that when the goal disappeared, the tool still needed protection. A body that never recovered isn't just a story about injuries and illness, it's the story of a man who never allowed himself to stop long enough to heal. Every ignored sign in this phase was a direct result of childhood lessons and career habits, that enduring is duty, that stopping is failure, that personal worth must be paid for with pain. And for that reason, when his body began to collapse from the inside, Wilkins didn't see it as a warning, he saw it as another challenge to endure in silence. His physical tragedy didn't happen in one moment, it was accumulated over years, over every decision to keep playing when he should have rested, over every time he dismissed fatigue signals, over every mistaken belief that he could endure indefinitely. And in the end, when his body could no longer hide it, everything he had suppressed rose up at once, signaling that the price of greatness had gone far beyond what any human should pay. When the last ignored signs could no longer be dismissed, that fateful moment arrived for Dominique Wilkins, not with cheers, not with lights, but with the cold stillness of a doctor's office, and the emotionless numbers on test results. The diagnosis of kidney failure was delivered like a suspended sentence, no climax, no cinematic drama, just a stark truth. The body once considered invincible was failing, and this time will alone couldn't save it all. For Wilkins, it wasn't just bad health news, it was a direct blow to the identity he had built his entire life around. The man who once soared through the air, endured every collision, stood tall after falls others couldn't imagine, now had to face the possibility of death arriving quietly, without fanfare, without a stage, no final game to fight through, no moment to prove he was still strong, just medical appointments, hushed conversations about declining kidney function, and the reality that without intervention, his future could be much shorter than he ever imagined. That feeling was cruel in a way different from every previous injury. On the court, pain always came with a purpose, always had a reason to endure. Here pain brought no reward, only the pure fear of a human standing at the edge of survival. Wilkins, taught his whole life to be strong, now had to learn to listen to warnings he had once habitually ignored. The doctors didn't talk to him about returning to form, they talked about staying alive. And in that space, every legend dissolved. No more human highlight film, no more titles, no more history. Just one human being, one failing body, and an unavoidable question: what happens when greatness can't save you? Facing that reality, Wilkins was forced to accept a possibility he had never allowed himself to consider. He could die, not as a hero falling on the court, but like countless other patients, quietly in a hospital, far removed from every symbol once tied to his name. It was in that moment that his life no longer rested in the hands of will or discipline, but depended on medicine and human kindness. And then salvation came from the place he least expected: family. His brother Gerald made the decision to donate a kidney, an act without noise, without show, but carrying the full weight of blood ties and absolute sacrifice. Wilkins' life, once the icon of physical power, was now handed back through a part of someone else's body. It was a bitter but profound irony. The man who had given everything on the court had to learn how to receive in order to keep existing. The kidney transplant wasn't just a medical procedure, it was a redefinition of the self. On the operating table, there was no room for pride, no space for the image of invincibility. Wilkins had to fully accept his vulnerability, had to trust the surgeon's skill and his brother's sacrifice, had to place his life in someone else's hands. For a man who had lived his entire life controlling his body, forcing it to obey his will, that was an unprecedented surrender. But that surrender was the hardest part. No one had prepared him for facing the fact that he was no longer invincible. No one had taught him that accepting weakness isn't failure. But in that life or death moment, he was forced to learn the lesson in the most painful way. After the transplant, when his life was preserved, Wilkins didn't walk out of the hospital as a victor. He walked out as a survivor. Every pill he had to take, every follow-up visit, every fear of rejection, was a reminder that this body was no longer entirely his own. It carried a piece of someone else, and with it came the responsibility to live differently. The tragedy lies here. The very moment his life was saved was the moment he lost the last illusion about himself. The legend had to face the truth that he was as fragile as anyone else, that no title exempted him from biological laws. But in the collapse of that invincible identity, something else also took shape. Wilkins began to look back at his entire journey in a new light. The dunks, the exhausting seasons, the times he ignored pain were no longer proof of strength, they were steps leading to this moment. The kidney transplant became the intersection between past and present, between legend and human, between celebrated greatness and the silently paid price. Facing death without glory, saved by family blood, Wilkins was forced to accept a painful but necessary truth: he was not invincible, and he never had been. That acceptance, though it came in the most brutal circumstances, marked the tragic climax of his life, where every protective layer of the legend was stripped away, revealing a fragile human being who knew fear but still chose to keep living. And from that moment on, Dominique Wilkins' existence was no longer measured by the height of his leaps, but by his ability to face his own fragility without turning away. After the kidney transplant that saved his life, Dominique Wilkins stepped into an entirely different phase of existence, where each day was no longer measured by wins or losses, but by medical numbers, pills, and a quiet fear that never left. Staying alive was no longer a natural instinct, it became a new, stricter, more unforgiving discipline than any training regimen he had ever endured. Mornings began with immunosuppressant drugs, with careful notes about dosages, timing, what he could eat, and what he had to avoid. The body once pushed to its limits for glory, now had to be kept in the fragile state of balance, where even a small mistake could lead to serious consequences. Wilkins lived on medication, not as a minor detail of old age, but as a prerequisite for survival. Every pill was a reminder that the life he now had was no longer fully his own, that it was sustained by medical intervention and someone else's sacrifice. That feeling was far different from every physical pain he had known before. On the court, pain came and went, covered by purpose and cheers. Here, pain didn't need to show itself outwardly, but it was present in every small decision, every daily routine. Every time the body showed something unusual, the fear of rejection became an invisible companion. Not loud, not dramatic, but always there, slipping into even the most seemingly peaceful moments. A fatigue that lasted longer than usual, a small sign of instability, was enough to send Wilkins' mind back to the cold doctor's office, to medical conversations where the word survival was mentioned more than form. He learned to listen to his body in a completely new way, not to overcome it, but to avoid harming it further. But this listening didn't bring peace of mind. It brought constant vigilance, a baseline tension he had never experienced while playing. As an athlete, Wilkins could force his body to obey his will. After the transplant, he had to accept that will was no longer the only deciding factor. This body, in a way, was no longer entirely his. It carried a piece of someone else, a piece of his brother, and with it came the responsibility to live in a way worthy of that gift. That turned every day into a test of ethics and emotion, not just physical endurance. Every step, every activity, was weighed through the lens of safety. Things that used to be simple, a hard workout, a long trip, an irregular schedule, now all carried question marks. Wilkins had to learn to slow down, not because he wanted to, but because he had no choice. And that slowing down exposed another pain, the feeling of losing control. The man who once commanded his body like a precise machine, now lived in a body that needed to be managed, monitored, and protected from his own old reflexes. Each passing day was a reminder that the price he paid for greatness was too high to ever forget. No longer his own body in the way he once understood, no longer the ability to ignore pain for moments of transcendence. Instead, there was prolonged fragility, where every decision came with the question, is this safe? The fear wasn't of sudden death, but of losing the fragile stability he had fought so hard to achieve. Wilkins lived with the awareness that rejection wasn't impossible, that this body needed constant protection, and that there was no room for the recklessness that once made the legend. The tragedy of this phase wasn't in intense pain, but in the persistent presence of the memory of death that had come so close. Every day he woke up and kept living, was also a reminder that he had gone too far, that the years soaring through the air had left a bill that the rest of his life had to pay off gradually. Living in a body that was no longer completely his own forced Wilkins to redefine strength. Strength was no longer the ability to endure more, it was the ability to accept limits. But this acceptance didn't bring immediate relief. It came with a deep sense of loss, as if a part of who he was had been taken away forever. No more feeling of invincibility, no more belief that he could overcome anything with will alone, only a fragile reality, where each day of continued life was both a small victory and a painful reminder of what had been lost. And in that reality, Dominique Wilkins kept existing, not through dunks that shook arenas, but through the quiet persistence of a man who had paid too much, yet still chose to keep living, even if he had to do it in a body no longer his own in the way he once knew. Continuing to live in a body that was no longer fully his own, Dominique Wilkins gradually realized a truth, even colder than the illness itself. The game had moved on without looking back. No parade, no official apology, no mechanism to compensate for what he had given. The NBA is a system that runs smoothly on short-term memory, where the present always swallows the past, and the past, if it no longer generates profit, gets filed away in storage. Wilkins wasn't treated poorly in a direct sense, he was simply left in the void that the system considers completed. The years his body was exploited to exhaustion weren't converted into any corresponding post-career responsibility. There was no long-term healthcare pathway, no acknowledgement that the entertainment once produced from his body had left lasting consequences. The game didn't come back to say we took too much, it just kept going, as if everything that happened was natural. For Wilkins, this created a systemic tragedy, not screaming, not immediate outrage, but one that quietly eroded faith in fairness. He had been loyal, had given everything, had accepted the trade-offs, but when the price became clearest, there was no embrace from the very structure that benefited most. Any tribute ceremonies, any highlight videos, if they existed, touched collective memory, but not the daily survival reality of a man living on pills and constant alertness. The NBA isn't an individual that can apologize, it's a machine, and machines don't know regret, they only know how to optimize the present. Wilkins understood this through his own experience. He didn't demand a public confession, didn't seek pity, but the system's silence, when placed next to irreversible sacrifices, became heavy. It sent a cold message: responsibility ends at the contract line, everything else is the individual's problem. The tragedy isn't that the NBA deliberately abandoned Wilkins, it's that no structure was designed to come back and care for the people who built its foundation. Success stories get repeated, consequences get personalized. Wilkins kept living, not with systemic support, but with personal discipline, with family, with the memory of life almost lost. There was no commensurate compensation for the years his body was worn down before medical science could catch up. There was no official acknowledgement that the price he paid went beyond what an athlete should bear. The game kept rolling, new generations kept flying high, new highlights kept pouring in, but behind that light was the shadow of people like Wilkins, living with prolonged consequences, without a protective corridor. This isn't a single personal story, it's a familiar pattern in elite sports. Glory gets collectivized, consequences get individualized. Wilkins didn't resent it, he understood the rules too well. That very understanding made the pain sharper, because when you've given everything in the belief that your contribution would be recognized not just with titles but with human care, the final silence becomes a form of denial. There was no parade for the painful post-career nights, no apology for the years of health traded away, only a legend kept living, resilient, in a world that had already changed the channel. And in that silence, Wilkins became living proof of an uncomfortable question: when the game takes too much, who steps up to take responsibility? The answer, at least up to now, is still no one. Aging after everything he had lost, Dominique Wilkins entered a quieter, more tragic phase than any injury or event before it, aging in a culture that doesn't know what to do with heroes who have survived. In America, where sports is an industry of the present, youth isn't just liked, it's worshipped. New faces, bodies not yet worn down, Unfinished stories are always more appealing than people who have completed their journey. Wilkins had no scandal, no loud breakdowns for the media to exploit, no controversial statements to pull him back into the spotlight. And ironically, that very cleanliness made him gradually fade from memory. No sensational headlines, no heated debates on cable TV, no reason for his name to appear regularly in a news flow always hungry for drama. Wilkins aged in silence, and that silence didn't carry nobility. It carried the feeling of being pushed to the margins. What he represented, relentless dedication, complaint-free endurance, unconditional loyalty, no longer fit the rhythm of modern media. His story couldn't be condensed into a viral clip, couldn't be retold through a series of shocks. It required listening, and that's something fast consumption culture rarely makes time for. Wilkins appeared less and less in talk shows, in debates about legends, not because he was less great, but because he was no longer new and no longer loud. In a world where value is measured by views and controversy, a man aging with calm becomes invisible. He didn't resist, didn't try to recreate an image to fit current tastes. Wilkins accepted that shift with the same quiet that had followed him since retirement. But acceptance doesn't mean no pain. Aging after having been the icon of physical power made every sign of decline sharper, every slower step, every time he had to weigh his health before seemingly normal activities, reminded him that time had won. And when society no longer paid attention to that journey, the loneliness grew deeper. This is a very American tragedy. Heroes are celebrated when they create entertaining moments, but they lose media value when they no longer serve the current hunger. Wilkins wasn't dethroned, wasn't overthrown. He was simply forgotten in a culture that always moves forward without bringing along those who built the foundation. No scandal to condemn him, no fall to pity him, no reason to mention him regularly. He existed in a gray zone of collective memory, too great to be denied, but too quiet to be remembered every day. Wilkins' aging, therefore, wasn't a dramatic decline, it was a slow fading. A man who once shook arenas now had to learn to live in smaller spaces, slower rhythms, moments that weren't recorded. And in that fading, the most painful question wasn't what he had lost, but what society chose not to see. The tragedy of Wilkins isn't that he could no longer fly, it's that when he aged with intact character, no scandals, no betrayal, the entertainment culture no longer knew how to tell his story. That hero no longer had media value, and in a society where attention equals existence, that became a form of cold forgetting. Wilkins aged like a man who had fulfilled his duty, carrying scars no one wanted to look at anymore, yet still there, living, breathing, and bearing the consequences of a greatness that the era had quickly turned the page on. At 65, Dominique Wilkins is still here, still alive, still present in a world that has changed far too quickly since the day he left the court. But calling it a peaceful ending wouldn't be accurate. His life now doesn't take the shape of victory, nor is it complete collapse. It is a liminal state, where survival is maintained through discipline, alertness, and acceptance, rather than full joy. Wilkins holds no regrets about his career. He doesn't deny the years he lived with everything he had, giving every ounce his body could endure. Looking back, he remains proud of the moments that made an entire generation believe humans could fly, that limits existed only to be broken. But that pride always comes wrapped in a quiet layer of pain, because every brilliant memory is tied to a part of his body that never fully recovered. At 65, Wilkins understands better than anyone that surviving is not the same as winning. Surviving means waking up every morning to a body that requires careful protection, a strict medication schedule, small decisions weighed meticulously to avoid risk. Surviving means remembering who he once was, but no longer trying to return to that image. He no longer seeks to prove anything to the world, yet he can't fully let go of the sense of loss. Some days Wilkins looks back at his career, like watching an old film full of color, full of energy, but belonging to a different person. The man in those clips seems immortal, while the man today knows very clearly the fragility of every breath. Acceptance came to him not as liberation, but as a necessary agreement to keep existing. He accepts that this body will never return to what it was. He accepts that what was lost is permanent. He accepts that the title of legend cannot shield him from the biological consequences of those years of self-destruction. But this acceptance doesn't carry the name happiness. It doesn't come with relief or deep peace. It's like standing firm in cold wind, not falling, but not warm either. Wilkins doesn't resent the past, nor does he romanticize it. He understands that the very choices that brought him to the peak are the same choices that led him to this present. At 65, he lives with the painful clarity of someone who knows everything has a price, and the price of greatness is rarely paid while the lights are still on. The slow mornings, the low burning pain, the times the body reminds him it is no longer entirely his own, all of it forms the true shape of his aftermath. Wilkins doesn't seek pity, nor does he try to frame his story as dramatic warning. He simply lives day by day, in a state of gratitude for still being here, but without the illusion that it equates to happiness. Perhaps that is the hardest thing to accept, that you can do everything right, live loyal to your ideals, become an icon, and still end up in a form of existence that is incomplete. At 65, Dominique Wilkins no longer flies, but he still stands, not as a victor, but as a man who has walked his entire road and accepted what remains. And in that somber acceptance, there is a quiet but enduring quality, honesty with his own life, without embellishment, without denial, without escape. Survival for Wilkins is not a bright inspirational tale, it is the ability to keep living when every illusion has fallen away. And as the story closes at 65, Dominique Wilkins stands there as living proof of a truth American sports rarely wants to face head-on. If history only measures greatness by championship rings, by complete endings and glorious parades, then Wilkins is always placed in the almost but not quite zone. But if measured by what one human being traded away, by the parts of the body that never recovered, by the years of silent pain endured afterward, then few legends in NBA history paid as dearly as he did. Wilkins doesn't need to be honored with precious metal or cold statues. His greatness lies here. He gave more than the system ever required, and that price didn't disappear when the career ended. History keeps moving. New generations keep flying higher, faster, with better medicine and more protective contracts. But Wilkins carries on his body the marks of a different era, where sacrifice was implicitly assumed, where endurance was celebrated as professional virtue, and where humans were only fully seen, while they still produced entertaining moments. Sports creates legends by pushing people beyond limits, but rarely takes responsibility for what happens after those limits are broken. Wilkins didn't collapse, didn't resent, didn't tell his story to demand anything back, and that very fact makes his tragedy heavier. He wasn't the victim of a single wrong moment. He was the complete product of a system operating exactly as it always has. A system that needs bodies willing to pay the price, needs people who believe their worth lies in how much they can endure, and then moves on when they are no longer fresh enough to be noticed. For American audiences, Wilkins' story isn't a call to turn away from sports, nor is it a simple moral lecture. It is a mirror. We love the dunks, the moments of soaring, the images that make hearts race, but we rarely stay long enough to see the price paid afterward. We applaud when bodies are pushed to the edge, then go silent when those bodies begin to break down. Wilkins lived true to the ideals the sports culture worships: loyalty, endurance, unconditional giving, and for that reason, his aftermath doesn't carry the shape of redemption. No final reward, no commensurate compensation, no tidy ending to let the audience walk away feeling eased. Only a man who paid with his own body while history kept walking, never stopping, never looking back. This story doesn't end with grand hope or healing message. It ends with lingering sorrow, because that is the most honest thing. Dominique Wilkins doesn't need salvation in our memory. He needs to be remembered as a human who gave too much in a world always ready to take, and then move on. And when the lights have gone out completely, what remains isn't the question of what he lacked to become a champion, but how ready we, as viewers, are to face the truth that every legend is built on the sacrifice of a flesh and blood human being. The story of Dominique Wilkins leaves behind a deep, quiet sadness, not because he failed, but because he won for too long with his own body. From a child raised in military discipline, never taught to express pain. Wilkins formed the belief that human worth lies in endurance. That belief followed him through his entire career. Every dunk was a trade of body for existence. Every season in Atlanta was a carrying of a weak roster on legs and knees exploited to exhaustion. When there was no championship ring, history and media changed their tone, labeling him almost enough, while his body had given everything. The tragedy reached its peak when he faced the kidney failure diagnosis, forced to accept that he could die quietly, without glory. The kidney transplant from his brother didn't just save his life, it shattered the invincible identity he had carried his whole life. Wilkins' aftermath is a string of days lived on medication, fear of rejection, aging in a culture that worships youth and forgets heroes who are too clean to become headlines. No parade, no apology from the system that profited from his body. From that story, the lesson for Americans isn't to turn away from sports, but to look straight at the price of entertainment. Sports creates legends, but without mechanisms to protect the human being after the lights go out, legends will continue living in pain. Wilkins' life reminds us that success cannot be measured solely by titles, and society needs to learn how to value and care for the people who sacrificed to create the moments we once cheered for. If the story of Dominique Wilkins made you pause to reflect on the real price of greatness, please subscribe to the channel to join us in continuing to listen to the untold journeys behind the lights of sports. Thank you for staying until the very end, and see you in the next video, where we keep looking directly at the real human being behind the legends.